Hello cave dwellers and welcome to the cave once again. In fact, welcome to the weigh-in because we've got a fight on our hands between these two machines. An Apple Macintosh over here and a Commodore Amiga. And what they're fighting over is an old saying you may have heard. It goes like this: the fastest Apple Mac is an Amiga. The fastest Apple Mac is an Amiga. It sounds kind of silly, and of course it's very outdated. We're talking about the early 90s here. But I'd like to put it to the test. Is it really possible that a Commodore Amiga could beat an Apple Mac at its own game, and not just any Mac, a current Mac, a Mac that was out at exactly the same time? Well, there's only one way to find out. Let's put it to the test here in the cave today and see what happens. So here then is our Apple. It's the LC3, available from 1993 to 1994. It featured a Motorola 68030 CPU clocked at 20 MHz, an optional maths coprocessor or FPU which isn't present here, up to 36 megs of RAM, so this system is nearly maxed out with its 32 meg, and it houses the original IBM 80 MB hard disk. That's a SCSI disk. The retail price was $1,350 plus the monitor and the additional RAM that's fitted here. Our challenger then is a Commodore Amiga 1200, released in 1992, a minnow in comparison with its 68EC020 CPU at 14 MHz, EC signifying that it's the low-cost variant with an address bus reduced to 24 bits. We have 2 MB of RAM and an of the period, or perhaps a little later, Connor 2.5-inch IDE hard disk with 350 megs of capacity. The 1200 also houses a compact flash hard disk, but our tests will be performed on the old Connor drive to make it a fair fight. Priced at $600 or £400 in the UK, it does leave us with some budget over the Apple. If we were in 1995, I would have spent this on a Blizzard 1230 Mark IV, an accelerator card with a 68030 CPU running at 50 MHz, and a 68882 floating point unit also at 50 MHz, with a whopping 32 meg of RAM on board. Why would I have spent it on that? Well, it's because it appeared in last month's donations video courtesy of Jason, so I have one here in the cave to put in the system. How convenient. The cost of the accelerator and the extra RAM would have taken us up to around the price of the LC3. It's hard to find the exact figures, but there certainly wouldn't be a significant saving on the Amiga once it's kitted out. So those are the fighters. Let's see what they can do. Our Amiga then is running some software called ShapeShifter to emulate the Mac. Allowing for the Amiga's own overheads, I'm sparing 24 megs of RAM for the emulated Mac, giving the real Mac an immediate memory advantage over our virtual Mac, and the emulated hard disk is stored on our old spinning drive to keep it fair. Our first test then is a simple boot up, and they're both hosting the System 7.5 operating system. Here they are side by side, and you're seeing captured footage from both machines. And this is where I got my first surprise. The Amiga with its emulated Mac has loaded more quickly, and not by a small margin. Both systems have all additional operating system extensions disabled to keep it fair, and there's a clear winner. First impressions really are good on the Amiga. I should point out at this point that any artifacting is as a result of my capture system and not present on the actual screen. Welcome to the party, Mac. So a couple of basic programs then, the calculator here, that works absolutely fine, as does Jigsaw, which was basically the minesweeper of its day on the Mac. Both working as you'd expect and hardly taxing the system. But most importantly, there's no real difference between the emulated and the real system, so the Amiga continues to impress me, but let's try something a little more taxing and see what happens. For our next test, we're going to unstuff an archive, a compressed file just like unzipping a zip file. The archive is heavily compressed and depends on CPU speed to work through the maths and uncompress it. It's not quick on either system, but once again I was surprised to see the Amiga's speed. The emulator then clearly making full use of the Blizzard card despite any overheads from the Amiga itself. Emulation might be a misleading term here. Yes, we are emulating another system, but the most intensive part of that emulation, the CPU, requires no translation of instructions. That is to say, both systems have a Motorola 68030 CPU at their heart with the same instruction set. Therefore, there's little to no delay in our emulated CPU processing compared to the real hardware. It's more virtualized than emulated, long before VMware, Hyper-V, VirtualBox, and all those other modern-day virtualization technologies. Our compressed file was in fact a game, it's Prince of Persia, so let's see how that plays on both systems and make a comparison. Impressively, yes, I continue to be impressed, there's very little in it. Again, ignore any artifacting from the Amiga's capture process. The game was completely playable on both systems and very enjoyable it was too, with smooth animation and no stuttering in gameplay or audio on the Amiga. I couldn't really separate the two in this example, which is an impressive feat but not really a victory for our Amiga. Less impressive, of course, were my gameplay abilities, resulting in very similar deaths on both systems, although I'd say the Mac one looks a little bit more painful, if quicker. Let's take the difficulty up again then for the machines. With this, it's SimCity 2000. I found the game to be playable on both systems, if a little sluggish, especially when navigating around the map. I'd give the Amiga a small edge in speed, but both were playable enough for me to create a small town, like these very poorly conceived and located examples, and it was also playable with large cities loaded like this one, Happy Guy as the city is named, and it's easy to see why. Who wouldn't want to live here? I went on to upset their happy little lives with an alien attack, which slowly stomped its way across Happy Guy, causing devastation at a relatively low frame rate. But it was the same for both systems, so again, no real clear winner, especially not the residents. Sorry, Happy Guy. To try and put a little more meat on the bones of our testing, I ran a benchmark using the software Speedometer. This tests all parts of the system and gives us a score. On the Amiga, it fails to run the video tests as we're stuck in a single resolution with 256 colours. This can be changed, but only in ShapeShifter before launching the emulation and not during. Nevertheless, it gave us a score of 6.5, that's 6.5 times the speed of the benchmark Quadra 605 model. Apparently. It's another system released in 1993 which ran through to 96. Not bad if it's to be believed, and the figures haven't somehow been eschewed by the emulation environment. Our real Mac, on the other hand, gives us a rather unfortunate 0.479, which compared to its higher priced benchmark Quadra system, well, that sounds about right. There are saved results for an LC3 here with a math coprocessor, which remember were missing. So if we compare the Amiga to the FPU inclusive model, we still see some impressive performance gains on the Amiga. Not the 13-time performance gain the original benchmark told us, but it's impressive to see nonetheless. And how then about this for a real-world test? This is Adobe Illustrator, a vector-based drawing tool which stores images as a series of points so that they might be scaled indefinitely without loss of quality. It uses mathematical routines to adjust the points and achieve this. Quite different to bitmapped images and extremely useful. The basic experience is similar on both machines, as you can see, but when we load something a little more complicated, like this illustration of a power drill, the Amiga and its FPU-laden accelerator card kick into action, presenting us with the image a lot quicker than the Mac. I even managed to zoom in 2 more times, refreshing the screen each time on the Amiga, before the Mac even managed to display the image once. This then is an example of our Amiga really blowing the Mac away with raw performance. I never expected to see Illustrator on an Amiga, let alone see it beat the competition at running it. And another program I never expected to see on an Amiga was this. It's Microsoft Flight Simulator. Like everything else I threw at it, this ran just fine, and it was the ultimate test for me. Back when clone PCs were called IBM compatibles, part of the test to achieve compatible status was for the PC to be able to run Microsoft Flight Simulator. Such was the demand the program puts on all parts of the system, including the CPU. Now, the frame rate isn't great here on either system, let's be honest, nor too is the Pilot. It's worth pointing out here that because of the different ways that the machines draw their screens, the Amiga using bit planes and the Mac using a chunky method, part of that additional 50 MHz in the Amiga's accelerator card is dedicated to the graphics conversion to display the screen. If you watched our CD32 series, you will have seen that it has an Akiko chip in it, a chip dedicated to exactly this conversion, so I can't help but wonder what this experience would be like with the addition of the Akiko chip. There's a rather rough touchdown taking place on Air Amiga and an absolute disaster on Air Mac. Which airline would you rather fly with? Finally, let's not forget the Amiga is, and always has been, a preemptive multitasking system, which means with a key press, I can drop back to my Amiga desktop and say, I don't know, write a letter like this. And then, in another key press, I can be back at my Mac again playing the game. Or perhaps you're not so keen on the music in Prince of Persia, and instead prefer the tones of Speedball 2. So why not fire that up on your Amiga desktop, drop back into the Mac, and the game is instantly improved with our Speedball 2 soundtrack. Is that the knockout blow by our Amiga? I'll let you decide. I didn't expect for 1 minute to see an Amiga running at the same speed as a current Mac. Sure, slightly slower, allowing for the overhead of emulation, but we saw a very different story. A story that proved that with the similarities in the architecture, the Amiga could not only match but outperform the Apple Mac. The fastest Mac was an Amiga. Well, that's pushing it. There were faster Macs and there were faster Amigas around at the time. Which was truly the fastest at this game is anyone's guess. But if you've tried this out with faster hardware of the period, and I'm not talking about vampire cards, things like the Blizzard card that we had here or an Amiga 4000, then I'd love to hear about your experiences and how you got on. Maybe you actually used it as a daily driver back in the day, and I'd love to hear what you did with it. I've had a lot of fun playing with my Amiga Hackintosh, and if you'd like to do the same, I've included some links in the descriptions that will help you to get there. As always, thank you for watching and take care. Retro Man Cave exists because of the wonderful patrons you see on your screen now. If you'd like to become an official cave dweller and support the channel, then follow the Patreon link in the description.